All right, let's dive into this pile of articles and excerpts you send us. It looks like we're going deep into the world of global trade. And specifically, President Trump's decision to slap tariffs back on steel and aluminum imports.
Yeah, pretty big news.
Definitely has people talking.
Mm.
So is this the start of a full-blown trade war?
Mm-hmm.
What's going to happen to prices? And how should investors be thinking about all this? Those are sort of the big questions we're going to tackle today.
It's interesting, because this isn't Trump's first go at reshaping the steel and aluminum world. Back in 2018, he had those tariffs that Biden ended up rolling back.
Yeah.
But it definitely shows a pattern in how he approaches trade.
Okay, so round 2 of the tariff battle. And it sounds like Trump's coming out swinging even harder this time. A full 25% on steel and 20% on aluminum imports, no exceptions. No special treatment for certain countries or companies like back in 2018. What's the thinking behind this more aggressive approach?
Well, it shows Trump's really serious about this America First agenda. You know, he wants to bring back manufacturing to the U.S., make it more attractive for companies to produce steel and aluminum here at home. And, we've already seen some reaction in the stock market. U.S. steel and aluminum producers, their stocks jumped up right after the announcement. Companies like Cleveland Cliffs, Nucor, U.S. Steel, Alcoa, they all saw a nice bump.
So, it makes sense, right? If imported steel and aluminum suddenly get a lot more expensive, that gives American companies an edge.
Exactly.
But wait, hold on. You mentioned those 2018 tariffs got rolled back eventually.
Yeah.
What's to stop that from happening again? Wouldn't that make investing in these companies a bit risky?
You're right. That's a big question mark for investors, that political uncertainty. What if the next president just comes in and reverses everything? Building new steel and aluminum plants. That takes years and a ton of money. Companies need to know the rules of the game aren't going to change on them overnight.
So maybe some short-term gains for investors, but long-term, who knows? And even if these tariffs DO stick around, no guarantee they'll actually do what they're supposed to do, right? What are the potential downsides to this whole protectionist approach?
Well, one big worry is retaliation. Other countries hitting back with their own tariffs on U.S. goods, that could spiral into a full-on trade war, which would be bad news for everyone. And then there's the impact on American businesses that need steel and aluminum. Think car makers, construction companies,
Right.
appliance manufacturers. They're all going to face higher costs.
And they'll have to pass those costs on to the consumer.
Potentially, yeah. Higher prices for everything, or even job losses if those companies can't compete anymore.
Yeah, so it's not as simple as tariffs good, imports bad. It's a lot more complicated than that.
It is, yeah.
All right, so what about the international reaction to all of this? You said the 2018 tariffs got reversed, but how are other countries responding this time around?
The EU, let's just say they're not happy. We've heard some pretty strong statements from top officials like Ursula von der Leyen, Olaf Scholz. They're calling these tariffs protectionist, saying they're bad for the global economy. And they're promising to take action. Firm and proportionate countermeasures, they say.
Ooh, that sounds like fighting words.
It does, yeah.
And didn't you say Germany's a big steel exporter to the U.S.? That puts them in a tough spot, especially with their election coming up and all the economic uncertainty they're already facing.
They really are. They need to protect their own steel industry, but they don't want to escalate things into a full-blown trade war, especially with their economy so shaky right now.
Yeah, that's a tough balancing act. Right. So we've got potential economic benefits for some U.S. companies, but big risks too.
Yeah.
And on the international front, the EU's ready to rumble. This whole thing feels like a tinderbox ready to go up in flames.
Yeah, and that's really just scratching the surface. This trade dispute could spill over into all sorts of other areas: transatlantic relations, negotiations on things like tech regulation, even stuff like NATO and defense cooperation.
Wow, so this is about way more than just steel and aluminum.
It is, yeah.
This could have massive consequences for, well, everything. Before we get into all of that, let's look at how this is playing out in the financial markets.
Okay, sounds good.
What are we seeing?
Well, one thing that's jumped out is the price of gold and oil. Both are surging.
Ah, the classic flight to safety, right?
Right.
I've been watching gold, and it's been on a tear this year, hitting all-time highs, breaking $2,900 an ounce at one point. But why gold? Why is it considered a safe haven?
When things get shaky, economically or geopolitically, investors get nervous.
Makes sense.
And they look for assets that'll hold their value that won't disappear overnight. Gold has a long history of doing that, weathering storms. It's a store of value.
Like a security blanket for investors when things get rough.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about oil? Why is its price going up amidst all this trade tension? Wouldn't you think tariffs would hurt global trade and therefore, like, reduce demand for oil?
It seems counterintuitive, right? But the oil market is reacting more to supply issues than anything else at the moment.
Supply issues. Like what?
Well, you've got the ongoing sanctions on Russia, the disruptions to oil coming out of Iran. That all creates a sense of scarcity in the market, which drives up prices. The trade war adds to the uncertainty, sure, but those supply pressures are the main driver right now.
Gotcha. So investors need to be really careful, do their research, not just jump on the trade war bandwagon.
Definitely. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Diversification is key. A mix of stocks, bonds, commodities, that kind of thing can help spread the risk.
So potential economic fallout, political shakeups, volatile markets, and a whole lot of uncertainty. If you're trying to make sense of all this, what's the bottom line? Where do we go from here?
Stay informed. That's the most important thing. Follow the news, read what the experts are saying, try to get a balanced perspective on all of this.
Don't just read the headlines.
Right, exactly. Think about the nuances, weigh the different viewpoints, and come to your own conclusions. And when it comes to investing, remember, caution and research are your best friends. Don't let fear or greed drive your decisions.
And spread that risk around.
Exactly. And keep in mind, this is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. We've looked at the potential economic and financial fallout from this trade war, but what about the bigger geopolitical picture? That's what we'll be getting into next.
Ooh, can't wait. So stay tuned as we explore how this all might reshape the global political landscape and what it could mean for the balance of power in the world. Okay, so we just finished talking about gold and oil, getting that boost from all this trade war talk. It's definitely heating up, but what does it all really mean for the global economy? Is this just a temporary thing, or are we looking at something more serious?
I mean, it's tough to say for sure, but, throwing a trade war into the mix probably doesn't help when the global economy is already dealing with inflation, supply chain issues, all that geopolitical uncertainty.
Yeah, for sure. It's easy to get lost in the big picture stuff.
Uh-huh.
But I'm also thinking about how this affects everyday people like you and me. What could this actually mean for our daily lives?
Well, one thing you might notice is prices going up on things that use a lot of steel and aluminum. So think like cars, appliances, building materials, all that stuff could get more expensive. And if the EU goes ahead with those retaliatory tariffs they're talking about on American products, things like bourbon, Harley-Davidsons, even Levi's jeans could get pricier too.
So hitting the wallet at the grocery store, the car dealership, even online shopping. Ouch.
Yeah, potentially.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the downsides of these tariffs, but are there any potential upsides for the U.S. economy?
Well, the people who support these tariffs say they'll protect American jobs and industries. The argument is that by making foreign goods more expensive, it'll push companies to invest in producing things here in the U.S., create jobs, boost the economy.
So it's like a forced reshoring of manufacturing.
Yeah.
But is that realistic? I mean, building new factories takes years, right? And what about the risk of future presidents just changing their minds about these tariffs?
Yeah.
Seems like companies would be hesitant to make those big investments if they don't know what the rules are going to be in a few years.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of uncertainty there. It's a complicated issue with valid points on both sides. The big question is, do the benefits outweigh the risks? And those risks are pretty substantial. We could see job losses in industries that rely on exports or imports, and consumers could end up paying a lot more for pretty much everything.
Okay, so let's go back to those safe haven assets we were talking about before. Gold and oil. Their prices are climbing, but are they really safe bets right now? You mentioned gold's hit multiple all-time highs this year. It seems like a lot of people are counting on it to keep its value.
Yeah, a lot of people see gold as a way to protect themselves from inflation and economic uncertainty. But, it's important to remember that gold can be volatile too. Lots of things influence its price, not just economic turmoil. Things like interest rates and what central banks are doing. So even gold, which is supposed to be a safe haven, isn't without risk.
So even the safe havens aren't foolproof. And what about oil? We talked about how supply concerns, those sanctions on Russia and the issues with Iran are driving up prices. But how does the trade war fit into all of this?
Well, the trade war definitely adds to the uncertainty in the market, but oil prices are way more sensitive to those supply and demand dynamics we were talking about. Tariffs might eventually push oil prices down, but for now, it's all about those supply pressures.
Got it. So bottom line for investors, don't just react to the trade war headlines. Do your research before making any big moves.
For sure, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Diversify. Having a mix of different assets like stocks, bonds, commodities, that's the best way to manage risk when things are unpredictable like this.
So we've got potential economic fallout, political shakeups, volatile markets, and a whole lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
What's the takeaway for someone trying to make sense of all of this? What do we do now?
Honestly, the most important thing is to stay informed. Follow the news, see what the experts are saying, and try to get a well-rounded view of this whole situation. It's complicated.
Don't just skim the headlines, right?
Exactly. Think about the nuances, consider all the different sides, and then form your own opinion. And when it comes to investing, always remember, be cautious and do your research. Don't let fear or greed control your decisions.
And remember that diversification strategy. Don't bet it all on one horse.
Exactly. Spread that risk around. And one more thing to remember. This is all part of a much bigger story. We've been talking about the economic and financial impact of this trade war, but we haven't even touched on the broader geopolitical implications. That's what we'll be diving into next.
Oh, that's right. Stay tuned as we explore how this all might reshape the global political landscape and what it could mean for the balance of power in the world. Okay, so welcome back for the final part of our deep dive. We've been unpacking the potential economic and financial fallout from President Trump's decision to bring those steel and aluminum tariffs back. But now let's zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture here. How might this trade war actually end up reshaping the global political landscape?
You know, it's interesting how these tariffs, which seem to be mainly about economics on the surface, could have much broader political consequences.
Right. We already touched on how the EU's gearing up for a trade fight, but it sounds like there are implications way beyond just like dollars and cents.
Absolutely. This whole dispute could really strain relations between the U.S. and the EU, undermining cooperation on a bunch of crucial issues, everything from climate change to defense policy. A strong U.S.-EU partnership is really important for tackling those big global challenges. If they can't agree on trade, it's going to be that much harder to work together effectively on other stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then there's the question of China. We haven't talked about them much yet, but they're obviously a huge player in the global steel and aluminum market. Didn't you say earlier that China's massive industrial growth is a big part of that whole overcapacity issue?
That's right. And while China isn't directly targeted by these tariffs, they're definitely a key player in all of this. How they respond to this U.S.-EU trade spat is something to watch closely.
So how do you think they might react? Could they try to use this to their advantage, like maybe forge closer ties with the EU while the U.S. is busy fighting a trade war?
It's definitely possible. China's been pushing its own global trade agenda, with things like the Belt and Road Initiative. That's all about strengthening infrastructure and trade connections across Asia, Africa, and Europe. If the U.S. and the EU are at odds, that could create an opportunity for China to step in and exert more influence.
Yeah, if the U.S. and EU are fighting, it kind of leaves a gap for China to fill, right? And what about Russia? They're already dealing with sanctions from the West. Could this trade war end up isolating them even more on the world stage?
Well, it's a tricky situation. Russia's been getting closer to China lately, both economically and politically. This trade war could push them even closer, which could lead to, well, a more multipolar world. A world where the U.S. and its allies are facing off against this China-Russia bloc.
Wow, so we could be looking at some major geopolitical shifts here. It's like a global game of chess, everyone trying to figure out their next move.
And it goes beyond just economics and alliances, too. This trade war could impact global security. Take NATO, for example. That whole alliance depends on a strong partnership between the U.S. and Europe. If they're not getting along, that weakens NATO, which could embolden adversaries like Russia.
It's crazy how something that seems to be about steel and aluminum could have such huge consequences. This isn't just about who sells the most metal. It's about global power dynamics.
Exactly.
So what does all this mean for someone like me who's just trying to understand what's happening in the world? What's the takeaway here?
I think the main thing is to recognize that we're living in a time of intense global competition. The old rules don't apply anymore, everything's changing, and we're seeing a shift away from a world dominated by the U.S. towards a world with multiple power centers.
It sounds like we need to be paying attention to what's happening all over the world, not just in Washington.
Absolutely. Staying informed, understanding different perspectives, and thinking critically about the information we're getting is more important than ever. What happens in those global capitals, it's going to affect our lives, from the prices we pay to the security threats we face.
It's not enough to just skim the headlines anymore, right? We need to go deeper and understand the bigger forces at play.
Exactly. And we also need to remember that we're not just passive bystanders in all of this. The choices we make as citizens, as consumers, as investors, they can have an impact on what happens next.
So what's your advice for someone who wants to stay informed and make good decisions in this crazy, changing world?
Stay curious. Keep asking questions, challenge what you hear, and don't be afraid to really dive into these complicated issues. The more we understand about what's shaping the world, the better we'll be able to navigate the challenges and opportunities that are coming our way.
I love that. I think that's a great place to wrap things up. We've covered a lot of ground exploring the economic, financial, and geopolitical aspects of this trade war. Hopefully you, the listener, have a better understanding of what it all means. Remember, knowledge is power. The more informed we are, the better decisions we can make for ourselves and for the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been great exploring these important topics with you.
And to all of you listening, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the issues that matter. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep on learning.